Hi there, welcome to the October the 17th edition of Serendipity-TV. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon, and we have so much fun stuff to go over. So before we dive in though, I need to make sure that I remind you that a couple of things. First of all, it's always super helpful for me to know that you can hear me and see me okay. So if you are watching, then please give me a thumbs up or type in where you're watching from. And just to let me know that you can, like I said, see me and hear me okay. There is also a little bit of a delay between when you type in a question, if you happen to have a question, and when I see it. So just know that once you type in your question, there may be just a teeny bit of a delay before I address that or acknowledge that. So that being said, okay, I see we've got some people here with us, so if you will, let me know, give me a thumbs up, or type in where you're watching from. It's always fun for me to see that, and then I'll know for sure that you can hear me and see me okay. So, excuse me. We've had a busy week here this week. Rebecca had her surgery yesterday afternoon, and she's doing much better now, and we're hoping that process of healing goes according to plan, and she'll be hopping around soon. She's hopping around on crutches right now and will be for the next several weeks, but everything went well yesterday, so thank you all for your well wishes on that. All right, so Judy says hello from Illinois. So like I said, I haven't gotten a thumbs up from anybody yet, so Judy or Michelle, I'm going to see if one of y'all will do me a favor and give me a thumbs up so I can know for sure that you can see me and hear me okay. I'm connected directly into the internet, so all should be in good shape, but I do want to make sure before we get started with that. So I hope y'all are enjoying some wonderful fall weather. We are here. We had our very first crisp, cool fall day today, and it's been really nice. If you got today's email, then you know for sure that I'm craving some comfort food, so I definitely have been in the kitchen working on some chicken noodle soup. So, all right, good deal. So I'm getting some good responses here. I can tell that you can see me and hear me okay, so I am gonna dive on in. So great, thank y'all so much for helping me out with that. It's always super helpful to know. Remember, I welcome your questions. Two things I want to let you know about. First of all, that I usually try to remind people of. One, if I happen to miss your question while you type it in or when you type it in, I will come back and read through those, and I'll make sure that I get those questions answered as best as I can in as timely a manner as possible. And if by some chance I happen to miss something, please always feel free to reach out to me either through a private message here on Facebook or send me an email at ellen@serendipityneedleworks.com. I've told most of you or many of you before that I fly solo around here, so sometimes things get busy and sometimes I miss things. So it's not that I'm ignoring you, it's just that somehow some things sometimes slip between the cracks. So what I wanted to make sure that we chatted about, because I did write a blog post this week all about needlepoint stitch pathways, and I'm going to take 1 second to read over here and just make sure that nobody's asked a question yet, so that I don't want to be ignoring anybody. So y'all hang on just a second. Okay. All right, so I don't see any questions pertaining to the blog post or anything at this point, so we will go ahead and dive right in. Thank you, Leanne. I appreciate your kind words about Rebecca. So if you have had a chance to read the blog post, it's this week I decided that I was going to address an issue that comes up pretty frequently. And when I got this book, I don't know if you've gotten this or not. It's a relatively new book. I think it actually released at the fall needlepoint market out in Dallas. The Lone Star chapter of the American Needlepoint Guild published this book, and it's a wonderful book. It's got over 450 stitch diagrams in it. Well, I'm actually going to call them stitch illustrations, and the reason I'm going to call them that, so you can see, I think you can see that pretty well. You can see the illustrations there, but the one thing, if you read my email from earlier today, that's missing is the numbers. You may have run across this in stitch guides. You may have run across it in other stitch books. Now, don't get me wrong. This is perfect. I understand the logic behind why the chapter chose not to include numbers or letters inside this book for their for the different charts. And they go over inside there's a tips and tricks section that does give you their logic for that. And I completely support them in their decision to do that. But the one thing that it does do when you have a stitch diagram or a stitch illustration that doesn't have letters or numbers on it, particularly for people who are new to needlepoint or new to using canvas embroidery stitches to embellish their canvases, it sort of leaves people hanging. And I thought what we'd do today is talk a little bit about that and some things that you can do that'll hopefully help you identify which stitch pathway you might want to choose when you're looking at a book that has stitch diagrams in it. Because I do highly recommend that you get this book. It's a really, really great book. It's got all kinds of wonderful information in it. As far as, the stitches are categorized by the way they read. So when I say that, I mean like they've got stitches that read straight, so that when you look at them, those stitches, when you look at those, if you stitch them, let me get it the right way. If you look at those on your canvas, if you stitch them on your canvas, they look straight. They're going to evoke, I guess the vision that you see is going to be a straight. It's not going to be a pattern that's diagonal. It's going to be a straight stitch, or it's going to be a straight a presentation. And then they also have them broken down into stitches that read diagonal. So if you're looking for something that's going to evoke a diagonal movement, then they have a whole section of stitches on that. And there are 6 canvas stitches on each page. And then they also have some that are, let's see, the diagonal. I think they have another, the other section is the ones that read oblique. And then once you get beyond that section, you have leaf stitches and laid fillings and black work, and then there are just some extra stitches at the very end. So it's a really good book, and one of the nice things about it is that it's spiral bound. So when you open it up, the pages are going to stay where you want them to stay, which is always a huge bonus for me. And then you also have, the nice thing is that it's a small book and it'll fit easily into your project bag. So again, I think Leanne asked, can you repeat the name of the book? It's called Grab and Go Stitches. Let me move it over. It's by the Lone Star chapter of the American Needlepoint Guild. Leanne, I don't know that it's available on Amazon, but it is available through different needlework shops. A lot of shops have purchased it, I know, and they have it on their websites. So that is a really good resource for you to consider putting into your needlework book library. In addition to that, there are some other wonderful stitch books that you can get, but they also are very much like this in that they have no numbers or letters on them. So if you aren't accustomed to using the canvas embroidery stitches on your projects, then you may or may not know where you're supposed to start. That's one of the reasons I like to include the letters and numbers on the stitch diagrams that I use, that I either post on my website or that I use in my stitch guides that I write. I like to make it as easy as possible. I understand, for people who are more experienced stitchers, then that does, I won't say it's not necessary to include that information, but it's not as necessary for people who are more experienced in doing canvas embroidery stitches. So that's just the one thing that I found particularly interesting with this book. So I wanted to make sure that I shared with all of you how you can go about choosing stitch pathways for your needlepoint stitches, for your canvas embroidery stitches that you're going to be using to embellish your canvases with. Okay, so let me move on up and make sure. Okay, so we've got Julie's joined us. Glad to have you here with us, Julie. Okay, so the main thing that I wanted to share with you today, 2 things. One, I want to share with you the 6 different kinds of pathways. And then the other thing I want to share with you are some guidelines that you can use that will help you to choose the best pathway for the particular situation that you're working in or on. So first of all, let's see. I've got my notes here. I don't want to leave anything out. So there are, like I said, 6 different pathway types: satin, running, double running, back stitch, run and back, and conservative. Now, the most common one is the satin pathway. That's going to be the one that you're going to use on, I don't want to even venture to guess, a percentage, but a very large percentage of the stitches that you use. And that's simply where your needle goes into the canvas, and then you come to the front, and then you go to the back, and then you come back to the front, and you're going round and round and round in almost a circular motion. So you have as much thread on the back of your canvas as you have on the front of your canvas. And what that does is that creates a lot of padding. It's going to be the kind of pattern that's going to create the least amount of distortion on your canvas, and it's going to create nice little fat stitches. So everything's going to look, really, you're going to get good coverage when you use that satin stitch pattern. Now, you can have a satin stitch pattern that's not in a straight stitch. You can have a diagonal stitch that has a satin stitch pattern. There are several of those. So, don't think that it has to be a straight stitch just to be, in a satin stitch pathway. Something that I need to back up and let me just explain quickly here with you too is that there is a difference between traveling and a pathway. So really and truly, when you have a needlepoint stitch diagram that has numbers on it, the numbers are what designate the pathway that you're supposed to take with your needle when you're executing that stitch on your canvas. So you start at number 1, you come up at number 1, typically you come up to the front of your canvas on odd numbers, and you take your needle to the back on even numbers. So say you come up at number 1, and then you go back to the back at number 2, then those numbers that are on that stitch diagram are telling you where to go. They're telling you the path that the person who created the stitch diagram wants you to take for this particular situation. So you're going from 1 to 2 and then 3 to 4, and what that does, those numbers help guide you along the way in order to get you to execute that stitch in the way that's going to be the best for that particular situation. Now, you also have, some stitch guide writers will use letters instead of numbers. The same thing applies for both letters and numbers. If you see ABC, A, B, C, D, E, F, lowercase, uppercase, or numerals, all of those are doing the same thing. They're guiding you along the path that is created by that lettering or numbering system on the stitch diagram. So that tells you the order in which you should execute those portions of the stitch to create the pattern that the diagram is illustrating. So I hope that makes sense. Now that's sort of a quick overview of what a stitch diagram is and what it does. It illustrates the pathway that you're supposed to take. A numbered one does. Illustrates the pathway that you're supposed to take on your canvas when you're actually stitching your working thread onto the canvas. Traveling is something different. Traveling, or your travel thread, that's actually 2 different things too. Traveling is the distance that you carry a thread across the back of a canvas to move from one area to another. So for example, if you had I'm thinking just about a geometric canvas, and it had let me back up. Say you had a canvas, because this came up in the Stitchers Club not long ago. Say you have a canvas and you have, sorry about that, y'all, I jiggled the table. You have a canvas that has birds on it, and the birds have 2 eyes. And so you want to stitch the eyes, but you don't want your thread to show through. So what you're going to do is you're going to usually stitch from light to dark. You use your lighter colors first and then do your darker colors, and many times eyes are black. So you're going to stitch your lighter colors first. Pretend like your bird's blue. So you're going to stitch your blue, and then you're going to stitch your bird's eyes. Well, maybe the eyes on the canvas are, an inch apart. Well, you don't want to do 2 stitches and then tie that off and then do 2 more stitches. because they're close enough together, if they are no more than 1.5 inches apart, then you can stitch those 2 stitches and then travel your thread across the back and stitch the other 2. Now, here's the thing that I want to make sure that you understand. If you carry your thread across the back of your canvas any distance at all, you want to make sure that you weave through the stitches that are on the back of the canvas. You don't want that inch, you don't want more than 1.5 inches carry, or an inch and a more. Okay, back up. 1.5 inches more than 1.5 inches of travel thread on the back. The travel thread is actually the thread. That's the thread. Traveling is the act. The travel thread is the actual piece of thread that you're using to do your work with. So, I hope I haven't confused y'all. Okay, so let me back up and just repeat that. The travel thread is the one that is the actual thread. That's the thread that lays on the back of your canvas when you go from point A to point B. The act of traveling, or traveling, is the act of going from A to B. And what you want to make sure you do, one, is you don't ever go more than 1.5 inches. And 2, if you're going, say, anything less than 1.5 inches, you want to weave that through on the back side of your work so that you don't have a piece of thread, a travel thread, that's 1.5 inches long just laying on the back side of your canvas. So you're going to weave through a few stitches, come up, weave through a couple more, come up, until you get your thread to the next position on your canvas where you're ready to execute the next stitches for your design. So that's the act of traveling, is taking that thread and weaving it through the back side of your work that's already established to get it to the place that you want to begin stitching again. Does that make sense? Please let me know if you have questions. If you say if you have questions, or if I lost you, say I'm lost, or say I'm totally confused. And if that makes sense, then give me a thumbs up. I hope that does make sense. So that is, like I said, a quick definition of traveling and the travel thread, which is not the same. Oh, good. I saw a thumbs up. Good deal. Which is not the same thing as a pathway. The pathway is the order in which you execute the stitches to create the pattern on your canvas. Now, I told you about the different kinds of pathways. If you are in the Stitchers Club, just take a deep breath, or let out a deep breath. Just go, because we're going to be talking about this in great detail in December. That's going to be what we're covering in our masterclass in December. So, you can always watch this as a recording and get the information from it, but just know that we are going to be going into much greater detail on this in one of the next master classes coming up. After we do beading in November, we're going to be doing this in December. So this will help you, especially if you if you have a book that has stitched. A lot of the older books have stitched illustrations in them, but they don't have letters and numbers. So it's like, okay, so where do I start? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different kinds of the different stitch patterns and what situations they're most useful in. So just know that's coming. Okay, so there are some guidelines, and this is something that is in this week's blog post, and I'm just going to actually share my screen and hop over and show you all that, because in case you are watching this and you haven't seen the blog post, or you don't know about my weekly blog post, then this will give you the opportunity to see where that is, so you can read it, and then you can also, if you want to, sign up to get the weekly emails that I send out where I share additional information too. So just bear with me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, and I have to get over here like that, and so here we are. This is this week's post, and of course I talked just a minute ago about a pathway, and I don't want to make y'all dizzy, so I'm going to go slow with this, but I'm going to get down here. See, there are, in case you're taking notes, you can stop, just listen if you want to. This is where I tell you what the 6 primary types of pathways are, and then here are the tips. So let's just go over these real quickly. First of all, you want to make sure that you stitch from a clean hole to a dirty hole whenever possible. Now, a lot of people don't know what that means. So what that means is a clean hole is a hole that doesn't have any thread resting in it. So it's an empty hole. And a dirty hole is one that does have thread resting in it. It's one that you've actually already worked a stitch in. So there's thread in the hole. You want to try and work from a clean hole to a dirty hole as many times as you possibly can, because that keeps your stitch definition much more clean. All right. Now, and I know I've talked about this, y'all have heard me talk about consistency. Consistency is key. And I hate to sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but you just can't be consistent enough when it comes to your needlepoint hobby, because that's one of the things that's going to keep your stitches looking crisp, it's going to keep your work looking neat, and it's going to make for a prettier finished project. So when you're talking about stitching, working layered stitches like Smyrna crosses and upright crosses, any kind of stitch that has more than one layer to it, this would include laid filling stitches too. Any kind of stitch that has more than one layer of thread to it. You want to make sure that the top leg, well, first of all, you want to make sure that the layers are all worked in the same order so that everything is all going in the same direction. And a good example would be a Smyrna cross stitch. So you have, or Smyrna cross. You have your base cross that's, your base standard cross that's topped by an upright cross, and you have you've got you want the top leg going the same direction on all of those units, because if you have one leg going one way and another leg going another way on the individual units, then your work is just going to look messy. So you want to make sure that that the top leg of each unit, or each layer, is laying in the same direction so that everything looks nice and uniform. Now, there's a kind of stitch pathway that's called a run and back pattern. And when you're using that kind of a pattern, you want to make sure that you use a chenille needle instead of a tapestry needle. And the reason you want to do that is because you want the needle to pierce the working thread. And your working thread is the thread that you're stitching with. So you want to make sure that you pierce that, because you want to make sure that that thread stays in line, and piercing it is going to do that. Something else to consider too is when you have a running stitch pattern, it's not a bad idea to use a chenille needle for that as well, because that will also pierce that thread and keep everything nice and straight. Now, you always want to make sure that you start and end with the same kind of needlepoint stitch pathway. So in other words, you don't want to start with a satin stitch pathway and end with a running stitch pathway. Don't switch gears midstream, because that's going to show on the front of your work. And then finally, you want to make sure that you keep your canvas holes clear of any kind of travel threads whenever possible. So that means if you are working a stitch pattern that has that leaves some open canvas, then you want to make sure, if you are traveling a thread from one section to another, you want to make sure that you avoid blocking those holes, because that can goof up your stitch pattern. And if you have to do that, then you want to just make sure that you can reproduce that or replicate that and create its own pattern, so that doesn't cause you problems in the way the whole front of the canvas looks, or the whole area looks. Now, Leanne says, what's a chenille needle? All right, that's my southern accent coming through. So let me stop sharing my screen. Let's see, here we go. So that's actually chenille, chenille. So it's a pointed needle that comes in the same sizes that tapestry needles come in, but it just has a sharp tip. It's used frequently in silk ribbon embroidery, so you use the sharp tipped needle to pierce the ribbon, so that your stitches and your when you pierce the ribbon, it's going to stay in place, and it's easier to do that. Easier to pierce that ribbon. It's easier to pierce the thread. If you ever need to pierce a canvas thread, use a chenille needle to do that as well. I'm going to type that here in the comments, because like I said, my accent sometimes causes me problems, and this is obviously one of those times. So it's a chenille needle. All right, there you go. So, well, y'all, that is a quick overview of needlepoint stitch pathways. I hope that you've gotten some good information from this, and I highly encourage you to go back and read the blog post over on the website, serendipityneedleworks.com. And I would love to have you join me to get our weekly emails. I send those out once a week, and and I'm always tickled to be able to to share information with you on the blog post, here in these weekly broadcasts, and then also in the emails. And I try not to make things too redundant, so I hope that you'll join me in all three places. If you have any questions, please do type those in the comments box. If you're watching this as a replay, I am so happy to have you here watching this as a replay too. And if you're in the Stitchers Club, remember we're going to be meeting inside the Stitchers Club private Facebook group in about 30 minutes at 4 o'clock, where we're going to talk about some stitches that you can use for the pumpkins on your canvas, because we have a sample canvas that we're going to look at. And we're also going to take a look at a canvas and help Melissa get started on identifying some stitches that she can use on one of her canvases that she's doing for her son. So thank you ever so much, everyone, for joining me. I look forward to seeing all of you again here next week, same time, same place. And until then, happy stitching. Bye for now.